Hello, I'm Faith Knutsen. I work for the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs at Ohio University. And this is Module 2 of the Grantwriting series for the Leadership Academy. In this module, we will work through an actual example grant. We will look at the ways in which the funder requests information, the ways in which this particular applicant wrote it, and a critical review of what the funder might think of the way that applicant wrote the grant. First of all, let's start with the background. This grant was written by a parent-teacher organization for an elementary school in rural Ohio. It was written to the state of Ohio. The state of Ohio was at the time funding small grants for elementary schools, particularly in rural areas, that would enhance nutritional education and nutritional programming in those schools. With that background, let's look at what the funder asked. On this screen, you'll see that in red are the instructions from the funder. The funder asked, first of all, for background and justification about the topic of the grant. And the funder was quite specific about the content, that there should be a clear identification of the opportunity or problem that was being addressed, that the project would have to impact that concern and meet the purpose, and that the goals and objectives of the project should be outlined. Finally, the funder was very specific about the limit of characters. The parent-teacher organization of West Elementary School in Athens, Ohio, in rural Appalachian, Ohio, described its circumstances, a place where childhood obesity and poverty is rampant in the population. They described the fact that this particular population, this particular school, is located in a university town where there is a strong tradition of local food systems. Restaurants serve local foods, growers produce local foods, and there is a vibrant farmers market. Some of the participants in the farmers market had children and friends at the school. Therefore, the connection of this need and this particular opportunity with local foods was the topic of the grant under discussion. The intention of the parent-teacher organization was to ensure that healthy food came from the farms, that the children learned where it came from by field trips, that they ate it in a salad bar, and that they were mentored, that the entire family could engage in this particular program funded by the state of Ohio. Looking at this from the perspective of the funder, obviously they would be comparing this with other applicants. They would say, are the number of children that are going to be reached high enough that it's worth our while to fund this? Are the applicants credible? Do they seem to have a program that they could logically implement in the time frame that they're talking about? Will there truly be engagement by the families and by the children in the program that's being described? The second part of the state of Ohio's application was the plan of work. This is a standard part of any grant in which the funder wants to know specifically how you are going to implement what you've proposed to do. In this case, the request was for a detailed description of the proposed project with tasks and objectives to be performed. What's extraordinarily important in this section is to remember that as the writer, you are very aware of what your program is, but the reader will be unaware of the program, unaware of the trajectory of where you're going, and trying to read it very quickly in light of comparison with multiple other applicants. Therefore, it's extraordinarily important to use pointers to draw the eye of the reader to the specifics, the most important specifics of what it is that you're describing. In this case, the writers created 4 tasks: provision of local produce to the salad bar, farm tours, in-school food practicum, and information to families. And for each of those tasks, the writers gave a description, the logistics of how it would occur, and the time frame under which it would be undertaken. This format was repeated for each one of the tasks to make it particularly easy for the reader to understand going from one task to the other. As the reader is assessing the work plan, again, the reader is looking at viability and impact. In this case, the viability was tied into the description of the populace of the school and the availability of local foods. The impact was attempted to be made clear by the tours to the actual farms, by the practicum in the school, and by the engagement with the families of the children involved. In addition to the work plan outline, although not specifically requested by the funder, this particular applicant put together a Gantt chart, a chart that shows tasks and time. In this particular case, the intent was to make it quite clear to the funder, quickly reading through and trying to compare one grant to another, precisely when in the school year each of the tasks would be undertaken and when they would be completed. The shaded lines indicate that the tasks are ongoing. The diamond shapes indicate that a milestone has been reached. Describing the key personnel undertaking a grant is always an element of a grant application. In this particular case, the writers decided to emphasize the organization, Green Edge Farm, that was affiliated with the produce being provided. The nutrition coordinator, who was a member of the PTO and a driver behind the grant, and the principal, who was highly engaged, who actually served in the salad bar herself and was a very key participant in the entire process. Reviewers of the grant questioned whether the principal of a school would actually be so heavily engaged. This was particularly true in this particular case. That individual was indeed a highly engaged principal. However, in retrospect, it would have been better had the writers made it clear and given some proof that she was that engaged. Evaluation and impact are increasingly important parts of any grant application. This application was written several years ago, and the evaluative measures described are standard in that there were assessments of the participants. However, impact is not well described in this particular evaluation section. These days, impact would need to be based upon an assessment of prior such programs, the degree to which children and families appreciated and engaged with nutritional changes, and the degree to which it was realistic to assume that such families might actually add fresh produce to their diet after the program was finished. The next section asked about the engagement of the state of Ohio, the coordinator for the Farm to School program that was implementing this particular grant. This is always a question in an application, and it is something of a balancing act for a writer, in that you want to be ensured that you are engaging with the funder in the way in which they want to be engaged, but you want to also show that you certainly know what you're doing and that you can implement the program without too much micromanagement. In this case, the writers said that the expertise of the coordinator was welcome and that they would hope that if it was necessary to have a pivot midstream, then the coordinator would be able to assist in that process. Finally, a budget is always a vital part of an application. In this particular case, the line items that required cost input from the state were clearly defined, and the elements of the unit prices exemplified. Furthermore, the state had required, quote, matching funds. That is an indication that the applicants were putting in money of their own. This was done in two ways: in actual cash, which came from the contribution from the parent-teacher organization, and also in kind. That is, that the salad bar setup, the tomato seedlings, and the open house time on the part of the farm were all donated to the program. Even though they did not cost money, they were costing the time of the participants, and this was considered to be an in-kind match. This meant that the cost of the entire program was lessened due to the engagement by the community, and this would have been viewed quite well by the funder. To summarize a proposal write-up on the basis of this example for the state-funded school salad bar. First of all, it's very important to follow the funder's format precisely, including any character or pagination limits. Secondly, having an overarching high-level summary is extremely important. An executive summary if that's required, a summary at the end of the proposal if it is not actually required. The point being that when the readers go back to assess all of the applicants, they will be able to quickly reread the high points of your application. The plan of work is always going to be a part of the application. Details there are extremely important. And markers for the reader's comprehension. Highlights, bullets, ways in which the reader's eye can be drawn to the key elements of what you're going to be implementing. A visual of the timeline is extremely important if that's possible, given the framework that the funder has provided. The personnel write-up should be succinct and compelling, and if possible, should highlight proof of credibility of the ways in which the personnel have implemented such programs in the past. A budget needs to indicate both the input from the funder and, if required or if being included, match contributions from the applicant. Evaluation factors with measures of success are an essential part of a winning proposal. And finally, to the degree possible, leave the reader with an impact one-liner. What is it overall that you as the proposer are going to do, and how is that going to differentiate yourself from the other applicants' proposals?